the first thing what came to my mind to call my husband's company, the United Silk Mills.
We're going to stop now and change the tape, and we'll continue with the story. When we finished the first tape, you were telling us how your family members were arrested, but nobody knew about each other. And you were saying that you had just called your husband's employer, the United Silk Mills, to find out what was happening. Can you tell me what was happening, what you found out?
The company put up 2 million marks bail to have everyone released. But since I didn't trust it very well, or not at all, I bought my husband, he was meanwhile in a prison in Düsseldorf, some handkerchiefs and underwear. He was very fussy about clean underwear. But it really worked. The next day they all were home. So the daughter, Hilde Falkenstein, went to South Africa, unfortunately died at a very early age. But her former husband is still alive and remarried, and their son lives in Toronto.
How long did you and your husband stay in Düsseldorf?
We stayed, well, after this event or incident, we thought about it, it's high time to do something. But as usual, fate had something else in mind for us. The Vereinigte Seidenwebereien, which is was the United Silk Mills, had a representative in Holland who was non-Jewish, and they had a large office there also. And this gentleman, Mr. Hoffmann, volunteered to come back to Germany and take my husband's job, so that my husband could move to Holland and work there for the same company. But we both had quite a bad feeling about the whole thing, not because it was so close, that was a good feeling, but we were not sure whether my husband could wait 6 or 8 weeks until he really could go, until he would get the permit. Sorry. So, but the company took care of it, and he left pretty soon for Holland. But I had to stay behind. And for 6 weeks, I had to go every single morning between 8 and 9 to the Treasury Department and to tell them where the money is. They were looking for a certain amount of money which we had given to friends who were immigrating right away after Hitler came to Baltimore. And they had great connections in America, and we gave them the money, some money. And this money we had taken from the bank, so most probably they were looking for that, and they want an explanation where the money was. So I had a very shabby-looking accountant, and he went every single morning with me to explain to the SS that I was a very spoiled woman who would swim in coats, in fur coats and jewelry, and I had spent all the money. I don't know whether they believed it or not, but after 6 weeks, and I was a wreck, they gave me the permit and permission to move, and they sent 2 men to my apartment to watch whatever would go into the trunk. So I had told my mother that I had an official permission to move to Holland, and she should bring all the silver and whatever she wants to have, because there was no limit what I could take. But my mother didn't dare, she was afraid. So since I didn't want to leave this opportunity undone, I asked a colleague of my husband's, who was a go to emigrate to Holland with his family, whether they had something they want to give to me. So they gave me their whole dowry, sheets and pillowcases, a whole suitcase full, a whole box full. And 2 years later, the woman complained that some buttons were missing. This was one of the little thank yous.
So what year did you get to Amsterdam?
We came to Amsterdam in 1936.
And what do you remember about Amsterdam at that time?
Well, we rented an apartment. I have to add, we had a lot of friends in Amsterdam, Jews and non-Jews, because we spent quite some time and a lot of vacations in Amsterdam. It was very close to Düsseldorf, was only a 2-hour ride. So we made a lot of friends and everyone tried to help us. It was a very good life, and most probably the reason that we stayed there. It was a good job, it was a beautiful country, people were very friendly, and I was pregnant in 1937. We really never tried, after we were in Holland, to leave the country. This thought only came around 19. But it really occurred to us after the Kristallnacht that maybe Holland isn't as safe as we thought it would be. In fact, or I told you that we had rented an apartment for my parents.
Can you tell me about your children?
My children were born on January 14th, 1938. And they were born in a Jewish hospital, which was very prominent. Now, I had an obstetrician, Dr. Weissenberg, whom I didn't like, but all my friends told me that I absolutely have to have this doctor because he is the best in Amsterdam. The first time I saw him, I thought I was not even half through my pregnancy. But the first thing he asked me, are there any twins in your family? And I inherited 2 sides of family with twins. My father had twin sisters, not his twin sister, but there were twin sisters in the family. And my grandmother from my mother's side had twins, and an aunt had twins. So it was possible, but I didn't believe him. And before my children were born, I made one more trip to Recklinghausen to buy the layette. And at that time, I was thinking that this doctor doesn't know what he is doing, and I bought everything for one child. But he knew better. He told me there definitely are 2 children, and they will be born after 8 months of pregnancy. This too I didn't believe, so I made it my schedule according to my date. But they were 8 months babies, on the day. They were born on a Friday afternoon, and almost, it was a matter of 20 minutes, according to Jewish law, they wouldn't have been twins. Marion was the first one, and Stephen came 45 minutes later, and according to Jewish law, that was already the next day. It was just before Shabbat. But he just made it. And after the children were born, this doctor turned around and was my best counsel, doctor everything. He thought these children were almost his children because it was the first time in 3 years that twins were born in that hospital, and 13 years that a boy and a girl was born. So it was a great day.
Was there anything else about the doctor that you remember?
But later on, after the war, I learned that he had delivered Queen Juliana, who was queen at that time when I was pregnant, of her youngest child in Canada, Princess Marguerite, who is still alive. I think she was born almost blind. She's married and lives, I think, in Holland. Yeah, I was amazed that this Dr. Weissenbeck happened to be there.
Can you tell me a little bit about Jewish life in Amsterdam and for you and your family?
In the family?
For you and your family in Amsterdam, Jewish life.
We always belonged to a synagogue. But I cannot say that we went very often because times turned bad in Amsterdam. It was not even so much, the whole mood was sad. I mean, we would go to the synagogue and we would go on the holidays, and but we were not very observant, which I regret now. And my children didn't go to a Jewish school because they were too small. And I was very busy because my husband still worked until 1940, 41. He was out of town a lot, he traveled. There was an office in Amsterdam, and I had to take care of 2 children, and Stephen was at that time a pretty sickly child, which you have very often with twins. So that was my main occupation. And since there were a lot of couples from Germany who had small children, we had a nice group to socialize. We took walks. Amsterdam, went to the zoo. Amsterdam was a beautiful city, and Holland a beautiful country. I really felt at home there. I forgot to tell you that I think we were there in Holland maybe 2 days, and we both started to take Dutch lessons, because I always feel that it's very important to speak the language of the land you are living in. It was very difficult. Most people say Dutch is almost German, but it isn't so. It sounds really like a disease of the throat.
You mentioned to me that your husband was involved in the Judenrat in Amsterdam.
Well, this came later. This came much later. The Germans invaded Holland 1940, in May 1940. And the invasion was a real horror story, because the Dutch thought that the Germans will never make it over their dams. They didn't have any trouble. They bombarded during the night Rotterdam, and a few days later they were in Amsterdam. what happened when the Germans invaded Holland, that after 2 days we saw some neighbors leave by car towards the IJmuiden, which was a small harbor for small ships to England. And since my husband had his car in front of the building, we tried this too. We packed our 2-year-old babies in the car and packed something, diapers, whatever you take for children, some cookies, some milk, and especially money, and went in the direction of IJmuiden. There was, within 2 hours, we had maybe 8 air raids. We had to jump out of the car, hide in ditches, and most of the time in some factories along the way. I remember that one, for my children, delightful hour we hid in the Verkade factory. Verkade is the biggest cookie maker in Holland. And they got their fill of cookies there. And then we went on. And about 6 or 7 miles before IJmuiden, we were stopped by a Dutch guard. Not a German, a Dutch guard. And he asked us something like, where are you going, or where are you heading for? And he right away noticed that we were not Dutch, that we had an accent. And he sent us back again. So at night we were back in Amsterdam. I learned afterwards that this ship we were headed for, going to England, these were all black market ships. These were people who wanted to make some extra money, who ferried the Jews to the English coast, that this ship sank. I'm not 100% sure, but I learned it from a lot of people. So there must be something to it. Coming back to Amsterdam was a terrible experience because we were on our way to move to a larger apartment and had everything packed when the Germans invaded Holland, and they right away took all the moving companies into their service. So we were about an hour on packed nursery furniture. Everything was packed until finally some private people moved us to another apartment. It's very difficult with 2 small children.
What else do you remember?
I remember that I had such a wonderful pediatrician. He was very, very well known in Holland. In fact, at that time when he became a doctor, I think he was the youngest man ever to pass the board, the medical board. And he killed himself the first day when the Germans came to Amsterdam. They were supposed, the whole family wanted to be killed. But his wife couldn't do it. So that was a personal, real big loss.
And how else did your life change under the Germans when they came into Amsterdam?
Oh, 1942, the roundup started. The Germans in the beginning in Amsterdam were very busy to follow their own lists. And by lists I mean they had some prominent Dutch people and some prominent German people who had moved to Holland, non-Jews, on their lists, and they were the first ones who were hit. But the Jewish roundup started in the end of 1942, no, in the beginning of 42, in fact. It started with tearing people away from their houses, out of their apartments, and taking them to different places. There was no, at that time, usually open spaces. But at that time, the Germans told the Jewish chief organization to form a group to take care of the Jews because they didn't want to do it anymore. So there were two names very important in Amsterdam or Dutch life. That was Abraham Ascher and a Professor Cohen. Abraham Ascher owned the largest diamond factory in, I guess, Europe. And of this Professor Cohen, I didn't know a lot. What had happened, the Germans had told Abraham Ascher that all Jews, Dutch and German, had to register for an ID. And these two chairmen of the so-called organization forwarded this message that all the Jews had to register at a certain date in a certain place. I do not know, it was a big building, could have been a hotel. And this was the first time that the rage against Ascher and Cohen started in Holland, because they thought that they should have fought the Germans and never to admit that the Jews had to register. The real rage before this started between the Dutch Jews and the German Jews, because by some foolish notion, the Dutch Jews thought that the German Jews had brought Hitler along, and that if the German Jews wouldn't have come to Holland, the Nazis never would have a chance, which sure is foolish. So Mr. Ascher and Mr. Cohen formed Joodse Raad, which means Jewish Council. They had a building in the city, and they took care for whatever the Jews needed. But everything was on order of the Germans. There was not very much you could do. You can always blame people, but in the end they all were caught, including Mr. Ascher. But these roundups were awful because people didn't know where they were going. So in the end, the Germans confiscated a theater and took out all the furniture, all the seats, whatever was there. And this was a place where the Germans and the Dutch guards took all the Jews. They would come almost every night to different houses with lists whom to pick up. And if someone was visiting this family and they picked him up too, they got an extra pay. I think at that time they got seven guilders for the extra prisoner. So these people at that time were taken to this Schouwburg, as it was called, Joodse Schouwburg. And they were collected by the thousands. And at one point, some people were required to help out at the Schouwburg. And among hundreds and hundreds of people who were nominated to help out was my husband. First of all, they only took people who would speak German and Dutch perfectly. So they selected about 20, 30 people as helpers in the Schauberg. But in between we also were rounded up at razzias. Between then and our real deportation to Westerbork, I think we were 8 times on a truck to somewhere. Usually they would let my husband go for different reasons. First of all the people who worked in the Schauberg had a white armband with numbers, which were registered by the Germans for the service in the Schauberg. Somehow he always managed to get me off and the children. But this also was a terrible work for him. He only worked nights from about 6 o'clock when the transports came in till early in the morning, and most nights I was alone with the children. The Schauberg was a terrible place. People were screaming and crying, and sick and old and young, people with small children. The real head of the Schauberg was a Walter Susskind, Susskind. He was a wonderful man. He was Dutch, but lived all his life in Germany and was also married to a German woman. And he took real risks. He found over the months and months that there were ways to let people escape. And my husband was his right hand. They didn't know each other before, but they both were fearless. So over 1 year, they let hundreds of people escape, people they knew or didn't know. They let people escape. The Germans ordered that the babies would be housed across the street in big wards almost, but they called it the crèche, which is a French word for, you know. And they allowed the nursing mothers to go 2 or 3 times to nurse their children across the street, but never checked really who came back or didn't come back. So over the months, my husband and Mr. Susskind, or I should say Mr. Susskind and my husband, found out that they sent mothers, nursing mothers across the street who were 80 years old.
We're going to stop now.
And if they were caught...
We're going to stop now and change the tape, and we'll pick that story up.